So here's the uncomfortable truth about leadership. One nobody really wants to talk about. It's not the bright, shiny beginning of your journey, that season of, spark and all that clarity that ultimately determines your legacy. The research and the historical patterns we dove into this week, they point to something far more demanding. It's really who you become in the middle that matters most.
That middle part is, well, it's fascinating because it's precisely the danger zone. It's that point where the initial momentum starts to fade, where expectations just rise exponentially, responsibilities multiply, and the noise of performance pressures, it just drowns out that quiet commitment you made to finish well. In this long season, the very thing you achieved, your success, it actually becomes your greatest vulnerability.
Right. And that's our mission today, isn't it? We often fixate on a leader's downfall as this one dramatic, headline-worthy disaster. But the research suggests that's just misleading. We're here to identify those unrecognized, subtle risks that cause this quiet drift, this slow, gradual erosion of character and clarity. Because if we can face those risks with real intention, we unlock the potential we need for the long haul. So let's unpack this crucial middle period.
Okay, so if we look at the patterns, and this is across different fields, business, politics, ministry, most leaders stumble not because they lack talent or opportunity, it's because they completely underestimate the silent erosion that begins, well, internally.
It's the subtlety of the failure. That's what's so scary about it. Leadership rarely unravels in a single obvious moment. It's always cumulative. It happens through these small cracks. It's the missed cues in a high-stakes meeting because you're just running on fumes. It's a critical decision rushed out of pure fatigue, or maybe it's a vital relationship you brush aside because you tell yourself, I just don't have time for that right now. This quiet drift is completely invisible until it's too late.
And the sources are absolutely clear on this. Internal erosion always precedes external collapse. This drift begins long before it ever shows up in a public mistake. It often starts with the loss of wonder, that initial spark of joy you felt for the mission, or the quiet toleration of small, seemingly insignificant compromises, or the subtle exchange of your original calling for something safer, like comfort, or maybe something louder, like applause.
We have some incredibly specific case studies here that illustrate this pattern. I mean, it's consistent. Callings are lost slowly, not suddenly. The sources lean heavily on biblical figures, probably because their stories are preserved over centuries. So they show us the long-term compounding effects of these minor decisions.
Exactly. Take Saul, for instance.
Mm.
He starts with humility, but he doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to be a tyrannical, paranoid king.
Huh.
No, his disobedience, his deep obsession, it was all born from these small, accumulating insecurities that he never surrendered or dealt with. He let the fear of what people thought outweigh his obedience to the mission. In a modern context, that's the CEO who, fearing a dip in the stock price, starts making increasingly erratic, punitive decisions, isolating themselves from the very people who could help.
Or King Solomon. His heart didn't just fracture in some catastrophic event. It shifted through these gradual accommodations. They probably felt really reasonable at the time. His political marriages were meant to secure peace and power, but they were spiritual compromises. Maybe at first it was just one, then two. But those small strategic shifts became spiritually corrosive. They just accumulated until he had 700 wives and his focus was completely gone.
And what's fascinating is that the rationale was strategic efficiency. It felt like sound statecraft. But the research suggests that leaders who rationalize small compromises in one area of life, whether it's integrity or family time or ethics, they will quickly find those compromises contaminating the whole system.
Wow. And then there's David, maybe the most jarring example of all. David, this courageous shepherd king, he drifts into a season of complete moral blindness, but the failure wasn't sudden. It wasn't at all. It happened in a very specific context, when he deliberately abdicated his primary calling. He chose to stay in Jerusalem during the season when kings went out to war. He created a vacuum.
Right. And that physical isolation, that abandonment of purpose, it created the perfect quiet space for moral failure to incubate. In our time, this looks like the leader who decides they are too important for the day-to-day work. They delegate everything and just check out mentally. When you check out of your purpose, you check into vulnerability. The pattern across all the sources is just undeniable. The middle is the decisive battlefield, and it's fought with these small daily choices.
So if the sources show us the anatomy of the drift, let's dive into the core pitfalls. These 5 silent traps that accelerate the erosion, the ones that often masquerade as competence or even diligence.
Yes. And these are the universal vulnerabilities. They hit mid-career leaders the hardest, right? When the load is heaviest and the stakes are highest. So the first is burnout. We often misuse this term. But the research defines it as much more than just being tired. It is the collapse of the inner world, a leaking away of meaning and emotional capacity.
How does that break down? How does it actually manifest?
Yeah.
Psychologically, I mean. The sources detail a three-part spiral that's really crucial for us to recognize.
It starts with intense emotional depletion. You just feel like you have nothing left to give. This leads to detachment, which shows up as cynicism. You start to view your mission, your team, even your customers with suspicion, maybe resentment. And finally, that spirals into diminished effectiveness. You're working longer, but you're achieving less because the engine is just running on empty.
There's a stunning historical parallel here in the sources, Elijah. This is a man who had the spiritual energy to run faster than the king's chariot, to call down fire from heaven. Yet immediately after that immense output, he flees into the wilderness. He sinks into this deep despair and is literally begging God to end his life. That dramatic emotional crash after such prolonged high-stakes output, it tells us something vital. Burnout is not a personal weakness. It's not a sign of poor character. It is a universal warning that you have exceeded the limits of human mortality.
It's the human brain signaling ego depletion. It's that simple. When your emotional energy is gone, your capacity for complex ethical decision-making, it just drops off a cliff. This is why a burned out leader is an impulsive, high-risk leader.
Okay, moving to the second pitfall, pride. Success is a powerful drug, isn't it? It creates this dangerous illusion of invulnerability. Leaders start thinking the rules that apply to others, well, they don't apply to me because my results justify my actions.
The sources point to King Uzziah. He started incredibly strong, building up the kingdom, but then came the tragic turn. After he became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He believed his success in military and civil engineering gave him the right to assume religious authority reserved only for priests. Pride convinces the leader that limits ethical, procedural, whatever, they no longer apply. They stop listening, and the isolation begins.
The third trap, and this one might be the most insidious, is compromise. Or as the research calls it, the quiet slide through micro-permissions. It usually begins with an internal rationalization, something like, just this once, or after all I've done, I deserve this.
We should really spend a moment on micro-permissions, because this is where leaders truly lose their way in the modern world. A micro-permission is a small ethical shortcut you grant yourself under pressure. It might be fudging an expense report by, say, $50 because you're just tired of the paperwork. It might be lying about being available for a meeting because you need personal time. It might be sending a slightly aggressive email that violates your own values because you feel justified.
And just like Solomon's single political marriage became 700, these small, tolerated exceptions, they accumulate. They reset your ethical baseline until suddenly a major ethical breach feels only slightly worse than the last little micro-permission you granted yourself.
The fourth trap is relational neglect and isolation. When the pressure mounts in the middle, relationships with your spouse, your peers, your mentors, they're always the first sacrifice. But we have to understand that isolation is not a neutral act. It increases risk-taking, it diminishes your access to an external reality check, and it absolutely fuels self-deception.
That's the space where David's failure happened, right? When he stayed home while his army was fighting. Isolation is the dark room where sin grows fastest because there's no light source, no accountability to break that self-reinforcing delusion. If you are making critical decisions, personal or professional, without consulting at least one trusted, neutral voice, you are significantly increasing your drift risk.
Finally, number 5, the lack of succession planning. This often stems from what the sources label identity fusion. This is when a leader's self-worth, their whole identity, becomes completely fused to the role, the title, the organization they built. They fear being replaced because replacement feels like irrelevance.
I think this is a huge stress point for mid-career leaders. That fear of stepping away, the anxiety of passing the baton, it requires a pretty significant level of self-security to empower someone else.
Absolutely. Succession planning is an act of profound humility. I mean, contrast Moses, who prepared Joshua and gracefully handed over leadership, or Paul, who mentored Timothy extensively. Contrast them with King Saul. Saul prepared no one. He actively tried to destroy David out of pure paranoia. Leaders who release legacy faithfully, they flourish in their later years. Leaders who cling to legacy fearfully, they stumble and they erode the very organization they tried to protect.
Okay, that is a critical diagnostic of the problem. And for you listening at home, knowing these pitfalls exist isn't enough. You need to know how to build systems that protect your mission, your integrity, and your impact for the long haul. Let's talk about the blueprint for longevity.
Strategy number 1 has to focus on the inner life, the guarded heart, and holy rhythms. As the sources repeatedly emphasize, leadership flows from your inner life. You have to guard your heart above all else because if that foundation collapses, everything you've built on it goes with it.
But how do we do that? I mean, in a relentless 204/7 global business environment, a lot of listeners might feel that concepts like Sabbath or rest are, well, they're luxuries they can't afford,
Yeah.
or worse, evidence of poor commitment.
And that's where the mindset shift is so essential. We're not talking about mandatory time off just to recharge. We're talking about embracing rhythms of rest, the Sabbath principle, not as a luxury, but as identity protection. It is a deliberate weekly declaration that your worth is rooted in who you are, not in what you produce. When those holy rhythms collapse, when your time for reflection becomes purely academic, prayer or meditation becomes sporadic, and rest becomes optional, you are inviting drift.
So, practically speaking, for someone in a secular business environment, this means creating non-negotiable white space. It's not just checking email less, it's defining a period where you consciously remove yourself from any metrics of performance. That reset keeps your identity from fusing with the role.
Exactly. And when you ignore that boundary, you risk spiritual erosion, impaired judgment. And that leads you directly back to burnout. Pitfall number 1. The Sabbath is the firewall against the collapse of meaning.
Okay, strategy number 2. This is essential for long-term survival. Embrace humility and accountability. Humility is genuinely the secret fuel of longevity. It keeps a leader teachable, open to correction, and it rejects entitlement, that subtle pride that says, I know best.
A leader who intentionally remains isolated is a leader who is already drifting. You need external systems of accountability. And this isn't about having a cheerleader, it's about having truth tellers.
Give us the profile of a good truth teller. The sources offer some really powerful examples.
You need a circle that includes different roles. You need a Nathan figure, the one who's willing to confront your blindness directly, even when it's uncomfortable. You need a Jonathan figure, the trusted peer who strengthens you when you're discouraged, but also checks your paranoia. And you need a Paul figure, a mentor or coach who has already run the race and can guide your strategy, pointing out the pitfalls they already navigated. Isolated leaders drift fastest precisely because they lack these external reference points.
That leads us perfectly to the final and most practical strategy, implementing a personalized red flag list. Vigilance is just non-negotiable in a high-speed environment. You have to learn to identify your own personalized warning signs across different domains so you can intervene early before those micro-permissions turn into a massive failure.
This is a self-assessment tool. Don't wait for a crisis. Identify your predictable failures now. Let's look at, say, 3 domains.
Okay, start with the inner life. What are the signs of spiritual or emotional drift?
Watch for a diminished prayer life or a growing cynicism toward the spiritual foundation of your life. Emotionally, look for persistent, increasing irritability where small frustrations really set you off. Or, on the flip side, emotional numbness, a sign the reservoir is dry and you're detached.
And in the relational domain, that's often the first thing to suffer.
Withdrawal and secrecy. If you find yourself consistently cutting corners on commitments to your spouse or family, or if you start lying by omission to your mentors about how you're spending your time or your money, that's a flashing red light, a very specific one. If you cancel your weekly check-in with your accountability partner 3 times in a row, you are actively choosing isolation over safety.
And finally, the legacy domain,
Yeah.
which connects right back to that identity fusion.
Watch out if you find yourself constantly protecting your position, pushing down competent subordinates, or just delaying succession planning because you feel threatened. That is a clear sign you are prioritizing your status over the health of the mission. If you recognize any of these personalized red flags, the research suggests you must stop your current course, seek counsel, and recalibrate immediately.
This deep dive has shown us that finishing well, it isn't about having a flawless record. It's about recognizing these consistent traps early, confronting them honestly, and building these daily systems. The Sabbath, the truth tellers, the red flag list. All of it actively protecting your character. Finishing well is truly a disciplined, daily choice made in the middle.
And the final thought the sources leave us with is this. The middle years are not a time to simply survive. They are the crucible or refining fire. Leadership failure is predictable because it follows these consistent ancient patterns, which means, on the other hand, that profound faithfulness and longevity are absolutely attainable. So for you, the listener, we'd ask, what subtle emotional or relational shift are you noticing in yourself today that, if left unaddressed, could compound into a pitfall years from now?